We are now going to go into women leaders in military and diplomacy and foreign policy, which we very briefly touched upon with Pippa Norris before. Our two main speakers are going to be Professor Stephanie Anderson. She's joining us, see her, from Wyoming. She is the head of the department of the School of International Relations at University of Wyoming. And then we're going to have Glenda Sluga, which is a professor at my alma mater. So I'm very glad she's joined us, the European University Institute in Florence. She's originally from Australia. She wrote a fascinating book on women in diplomacy in the centuries. And who's gonna begin with the two of you? Who wants to go? Maybe we give the word to Glenda because she has a more historical perspective. Off we go.
All right, thank you so much. All right, so I'm not going to talk for very long, just try and make some points. And I want to take as my starting point the rather curious fact, as I see it, of the modern world, that across the ideological divide of conservatism and liberalism, that we find that more women have been appointed to political roles as diplomats and even to leading foreign affairs portfolios, long before cracking the glass ceiling of presidency or prime ministership. Even as in some countries that ceiling remains intact. So right now, in the context of the Ukraine war, for example, we have Roberta Metsola and Ursula von der Leyen leading the EU institutional response. But before them, Catherine Ashton and Federica Mogherini served as high representatives for the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. In the US, there have been 71 secretaries of state. Only 3 of them have been women. Madeleine Albright, Condoleezza Rice, and Hillary Clinton, but that's 3 more than there have been presidents. So since 2014, we have also had European and other states adopting the principles of what is called feminist foreign policy. And in fact, there's a webinar on tomorrow if you want to go and find out what is being discussed about the implications of this feminist foreign policy for the war in Ukraine. So it's one of the historical arguments I want to make that's part of a new gender history of international politics, that this accommodation of women in international politics is not simply an anomalous consequence of modernity. It's contiguous with practices since the origins of diplomacy, in which women have acted as agents of cross-state and cross-cultural information gathering, alliance building and networking, and as political negotiators, even if this was not always uncontroversial. So there's a long history then to the participation of women and their profiles in this history of the politics between states. And if we needed a provocation, you could find one in a 1939 history of diplomacy by the quite famous British diplomat, Harold Nicholson, who wrote that, if there was one thing that diplomacy was not, it was, in fact, what happened in under the auspices of women in a specific site, and that is the salon. And his reference was to the salons really of the 18th and 19th centuries, where indeed contemporary diplomatic manuals argued the training of diplomats took place. So if you went back 200 years or 300, you'd find references to the salon as the site of training of diplomats. And the argument went, often on a chauvinist basis, that the French were the best diplomats, and that's because they were trained in the salons of elite women who were experts at facilitating conversation and with that negotiation. Indeed, before the modern 19th century expansion of foreign ministries and their bureaucracies populated the institution with often men of all classes who took exams, women were as likely to be named ambassadrices or ambassadresses when they were married to ambassadors. And in these roles, they could claim the prerogative of writing formal reports, observing local politics to send back to the Home Office, or running salons, which they used not simply to train men, but to negotiate foreign policy issues themselves, informally, of course, but often to influential ends. So this is the second point I want to make. that we can actually now articulate a new history of diplomacy that shows that Western non-sovereign women intervened in questions of foreign policy through the early modern and modern periods. And I say European because I haven't done the broader non-European research, which would be interesting to look at. Women's presence in international political life was both aggravating and accepted, although by the 19th century, which we know as the bourgeois century, women were increasingly vulnerable to criticism and attack on the grounds not only of impropriety for occupying public space in this political way, but also because their actions were represented as the antithesis of a new professional diplomatic and political institution, really, populated by professional men. So what happened was already across the European context and the Western context was already occurring in Britain at the turn of the 19th century under the influence of the new kind of separate spheres model of gender relations. And we know, though, that in France from the 1810s, as Napoleon's grip on French political life hardened, French salons were less likely to be places in which women could comfortably dominate. And this we know from the pen of Germaine de Stael, who was a really important diplomatic figure in the early 19th century, and I'll get to her in a minute. So in the early 19th century, while Napoleon was still in control in France, he tried to supersede political salons by creating alternative government salons. And these were run by foreign ministers. They took the form of drawing room receptions or dinners hosting visiting dignitaries and diplomats. And there were spaces in which women were relegated to the role of the maîtresse de maison. And they did the honors of the house, supporting their husband and cultivating respect for the emperor. And this was not the model previously of women's place in the salon, where the salonière was the woman. But it did replicate this more bourgeois model of the role of the female diplomat. And there are really interesting resonances of this through the 20th century, indeed, in how women were brought into the diplomatic realm in specific national contexts as the wives of diplomats. Now, what are the implications of adding women in this way? Why is this history relevant? So the third point I want to make is that this new history of women and diplomacy, and more broadly of women's roles in this politics between states as it gets invented in the 19th century, really places them at the center of the invention of international order. And that's an argument I've just finished making in A New History on what I call the invention of international order, which also incorporates a close study of Germaine de Stael and her role elaborating the philosophical and practical terms of the political debate about what the post-Napoleonic Europe should look like in the context of the downfall of Napoleon that she helped to orchestrate through diplomatic means. Just to say briefly that in the early 19th century, from 1812, so 200 years more ago, Stael was producing essays and pamphlets that attempted to persuade the negotiators of the Treaty of Paris, which was the first treaty negotiated with Napoleon and between Napoleon and the European allies, to ban the slave trade as a condition of peace, to end France's economic blockade of the continent, and to take action against political tyranny on behalf of constitution-based political societies. She had basically a democratic or liberal, let's say, agenda for the kind of European launched, post-Napoleonic War international order. And the theoretical innovation of her view, of her version of liberty, was to represent liberalism, which was a new concept, as both universal in a European framing and socially adaptable. So it wasn't just about Britain or France, but it was a more universal principle. And she asserted throughout her writing that in fact the liberal tenets of the ideological revolution taking place were a critical part of the reason for fighting Napoleon. And in this way, she's really important in a process that an international historian called Paul W. Schroeder famously described as, you know, characteristic of this period and initiating a revolution in thinking. But he assumes this was the work of men, but in fact, she has a really important place in this. Now, for all the power of her pen, it's her salon that Napoleon acknowledged as fatal. She said, he says that she gathered in it all the partisan Republicans and royalists, put them in each other's presence, uniting them all against me. She attacked me from all sides. So I think her role in this period underscores the symbolic and practical significance of this female idea of the salon in the story of modern diplomacy as the site of international politics, the politics between states, and as the model of diplomatic methods. On her own description, she said that it was a space where, in the spirit of enterprise, you tried to bring, two parties together and find some kind of resolution in their conceptions of each other and their ambitions. So stirring in, to take an older metaphor from women's history, stirring women into this history of diplomacy and international politics, I believe, gives us a new view onto how we understand the long history of ordering that's part of international politics, like gender ordering. So women are there, then they're not there, how their roles change. It also, I think, expands our capacity or the debates that are being sort of considered in the realm of the politics between states, in the sense that this liberal agenda was of constitution-based states was being articulated, as well as anti-slavery, thanks to the kind of role of women in this sphere. And there are lots of examples, I think, of how even after the rise of the bureaucratized foreign ministry, in fact, saloniers continue to take roles or what we think of as petticoat diplomacy. And there's some really good books on this in the 19th century in the US, for example. That said, the 20th century history of diplomacy and the politics between states is also clearly a history of the struggle of women to be allowed into the institutionalized corridors of diplomatic activity. And this became this, desire to have proper roles, formal roles in foreign affairs became a prominent part of, the feminist struggle for equal work conditions and capacities. And, and that the memory of women's participation, earlier participation, actually is very thin in that context. So we think of the women's participation starting fairly recently. So to conclude, I want to argue that, I would have to argue on a much longer sort of scale that women are central to this history in the past, and as important as they are in the present, that they've been crucial engagers of the politics between states and a multilateral diplomacy for a variety of reasons for a very long time. And they help us understand the ordering that is part of the contemporary international order with all its challenges, and including the entrenchment of masculinity of various kinds and the simultaneous presence and absence of women that is as characteristic, stretching back into the early 19th century. And they help us to understand a broader spectrum of international thinking. And, if one was to look at this idea in the context of the 20th century, we would have to include a much broader and variegated history of thinking about war and peace through the 20th century, of politics and violence, as well as integral parts of how we understand the history of international thought as well. And of course, there are new volumes coming out daily on this in this topic area. We can discuss that. And we return back to the kind of strange, almost anomalous status of feminist foreign policy, and now formally taken up by various states, and in some cases articulated by feminist and female foreign ministers in the current context. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Glenda, and I would go to you, Steph.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. I'm just sharing my screen. Okay, can you see the PowerPoint okay, everyone?
Yes. We
Looks
can.
good. Okay, excellent. Well, today, excuse me here, what I'm talking about is sort of a more specific policy issue than Glenda. And so it'll be gender mainstreaming and EU crisis management mission. So how it's being implemented there. So this all stems back to the United Nations Security Council resolution in 2013-25. And it was a landmark legal and political framework to acknowledge the importance of women in the inclusion of peace negotiations, peacekeeping operations, post-conflict peace building, humanitarian planning, and governance. It's the idea that women should be at the negotiating table, that they have something to contribute when it comes to peace and security, which has traditionally been dominated by men. So specifically, it calls for women at all levels of decision-making, including national, regional, international institutions, in mechanisms for the prevention and management of conflict, peace negotiations, very importantly in peace operations as soldiers, right? As police, as civilians actually being on the ground. So how do they hope to prevent violence against women? Very simply by prosecuting those responsible, that you don't get off scot-free. I mean, if we think about rape as a tool of warfare, that's certainly come to the fore once again, sadly, once again in Ukraine. This is an issue where people have to have the specter of a prosecution over their heads. There has to be some sort of reckoning with it. There's also discussion of refugee camps. And I want to talk about the UK in a minute that way, but of making sure that women and children refugees are properly taken care of, to make sure that sexual violent crimes are dealt with, especially when it comes to crimes against humanity. There's a general strengthening of women's rights under international law and supporting local women's peace initiatives and conflict resolution processes. So what does it mean, gender mainstreaming? I think if there's a problem with this idea, a lot of it stems from people not being sure what it actually means. And so in an anecdote I had from my interviews in the EU, they were building a bridge in Sri Lanka. And there was a person who asked, well, what about the gender aspects? And the man answered, well, I'm building a bridge. I don't see what that has to do with gender at all. And so the person who was a man replied, well, who will be crossing this bridge? Who will be using this bridge? And he goes, well, people. And the guy responds, well, do you mean like men, women, and children? Yeah. And so how will they be crossing this bridge? With cars. And he said, well, do they all have cars? Well, no. Well, who doesn't have cars? Well, women probably don't have cars. And it's like, okay, well, how will the women cross? It's like, well, they'll walk. It's like, then don't you think it would be a good idea to have a pedestrian, a place for pedestrians on the bridge? And the guy's like, oh, that would be a good idea. And he said, well, congratulations, you just learned what gender mainstreaming means. And so it's really just about taking a woman's perspective because she has different needs from men. It's also about avoiding unintended consequences. So in Afghanistan, one of the major issues was making sure that the health and safety of people overall was supported and maintained. And this meant I see there's a question. If you don't mind, I'll take that question at the end of the presentation. So a question that came up is, what about fresh drinking water? What about clean drinking water? And so there was a big movement to put taps and bring running water to the different buildings. But it turned out that this actually isolated women. Women under strict Islam, and you know, in Afghanistan, there was the wearing of the burqa covering. The only time they could actually meet with other women and socialize was getting the water several times a day. That was the only time and the only way that the husbands let them leave the house. So perhaps ironically, unintentionally, by having taps inside the house, women were more isolated than ever. We can talk about today, still issues. On 13 April 2022, the United Nations rebuked the United Kingdom for matching lone female Ukrainian refugees with single men who actually requested to be housed with women and children. And so people forgot in the UK, certainly, that these were vulnerable populations, and maybe it wasn't a good idea to match them with single men, because it left open avenues for sexual exploitation. So even though this happened, the 1325 happened and passed unanimously in the year 2000, 22 years later, even in countries like the UK, which one would think should know better, this sort of thing is still happening. So let's talk about the European Union. Does it have an image problem? Because whenever we talk about women, we're really talking about issues of masculinity as well. It's the flip side. And this is a cartoon from The Economist, which you can see says that the European Union is impotent. So what is the European Union? I just want to establish it's these countries that we have here, 27 countries. You'll see the UK is not among them here. And it forms a version of a confederation. There's a whole issue in political science as to exactly what it is, but they're certainly working closely together with confederal attributes. The Eurozone crisis actually brought them closer together, as has the immigration crisis, and they coordinate their policies and work well together. So they have pushed to have, this is also over the past 30 years, a foreign and security policy. And this poster was actually placed in all the capital airports to promote to the people that their choice was peace. This was shown in opposition to the United States, especially during the Iraq War, which was seen as quite militaristic, that it was the EU that was concerned about peace. And it says in the bottom, the European Union is working for peace, stability, and security and stability. In actuality, we're really talking about 27 countries that are marching in step, as opposed to a single security and defense policy. It's really about coordination, having a chorus, if you will, rather than one lead singer. But how powerful is the EU? If you look at political cartoons, a great number of them depict the EU as a woman. And this is one where you've got, this is granted a little bit old now, but from 2007, here the EU is sort of a nice old lady celebrating her, if I should say old at 50, celebrating her 50th birthday. And here you have Putin and Bush, and they're going to blow up the birthday cake. Here's another one where Angela Merkel, representing the EU, is clearly out of her depth when it comes to working with Russia, the United States, Iran, and North Korea. Something I found interesting is about the same time as the 1325 resolution is the idea that the EU is trying to find its own identity. And part of that identity is putting itself in the role of hero, in a heroic narrative to try to save the world. Now, I give you a direct quotation because that sounds quite strong, but it says here, the EU has to play, the role the EU has to play is that of a power resolutely doing battle against all violence, all terror, and all fanaticism, but which also does not turn a blind eye to the world's heartrending injustices. This is a high bar, I would argue, for anyone. And I just want to show you a couple of minutes. I hope the sound comes through of this video that they created promoting themselves.
This is a European warship conducting security operations in this area. If you observe any suspicious or illegal activity or require assistance, call on channel 16 out there.
It's the early 2000s, and Somali pirates operating in the Gulf of Aden are terrorizing international shipping and jeopardizing the supply of vital food aid to Somalia. The increasing threat at sea, combined with a humanitarian disaster on land, places the EU in a tough position to act or not to act.
I think it's quite clear that the EU is going to act, yes, with this. And in fact, they're compelled to. They're compelled to be a hero, a world policeman, certainly. And then I see things like this. This is from the cover of one of their in-house publications, where they literally use women's bodies to promote themselves. This seems to me a problem, just another form of using women's bodies. You can see the heads are cut off, but it shows here that the EU is tough and yet compassionate and also very progressive. Woman's holding a child at the same time she's wearing fatigues and holding a gun. So what does the EU have to do specifically to comply with gender mainstreaming? Well, at the time with the UK, all member states had to adopt a national action plan. As of 2015, only 17 had. I have to go back and double check the numbers, but they haven't grown very much. They're also supposed to appoint gender advisors to all, excuse me, this should have been, I wrote UN by mistake, all EU peace operations. They're supposed to consider the needs of women and girls and incorporate the perspectives of women's organizations. This really hasn't happened. There haven't been very many gender advisors who are in the missions. In some cases, when they choose the gender advisors, I'm thinking of one case of an Austrian woman who was an academic who taught gender and women's studies, and she was put into I'll just say in the Balkans, I won't say specifically which one, but she was sent to one of the missions there. And I have to say that her academic culture did not mesh well with the military culture that was there. And she felt that she wasn't truly consulted when it came to these issues. On the other hand, Charlotte Isaacson, military gender advisor, and she worked extremely well with the head of the mission. And in that case, because they were so close, she had great influence over him. In other cases, not so much. Gender is just another duty assigned among others in a portfolio. If the head of mission's not interested, then it hasn't been a priority. Think about this, the gender advisor is supposed to review all policy for input, but do you know how much work that is? Can you imagine if there's one person has to go through all those documents? It's just not possible. And then ultimately there's no accountability. As I said, it's a type of confederation, especially in areas of security and defense. There's still sovereignty. So just coming into some examples, and then I'll conclude. So let's talk about the learning curve. Remember how you're supposed to consult women's organizations? Well, in the case of Kosovo, they did, but the Kosovar women were very unhappy with how it worked. They say nothing is articulated in 1325. It's just dust in your eyes. They're misty words, checkmate words, and nothing else. You can see this other quotation, I'll never go to another conference because it's just talk. So what is the problem? Well, there's a theoretical paper by Huffner, Burton, and Pollock, and they say that gender mainstreaming only works with hard incentives, that this isn't a question of carrots, there has to be a bureaucratic stick. And if you don't have, it's really difficult to do the stick in this area, again, because there's so much sovereignty in the areas of foreign and security policy. I think well, that's a serious issue. I think the bigger issue is ignorance and socialization. There's a real misunderstanding as to what 1325 means. Is it equal pay for equal work? And that's what people think about. There are different views of prostitution in different, it's legal in some European countries, it's illegal in others. There's the idea that boys will be boys, it really doesn't matter. I talked to one Swedish general who was very pro-gender mainstreaming, but he said he was afraid to push it too hard for fear of being known as the gender general, because this would make him look less powerful, less manly. We have to decide for ourselves. And then very often they forget to do the gender training. Whoops, what do you do then? There's not much. So what can be done? Not much, as I say. The underlying basis of all cooperation in foreign and security policy is that decisions are made by consensus because you cannot embarrass other countries. Gender issues could embarrass governments. And so no country wants to point that out. it's diplomatic suicide. Sweden is not going to point out that, let's say, Italy has neglected the gender aspects. It's just not going to happen. Ultimately, you have to wonder whether it's just an image problem. Institutions involved in the CSDP are hyper-masculinized. They're not really in tune with gender issues. Clearly, the EU is trying to masculinize their image in any case, in this heroic narrative. It's certainly hard to be the protector of the weak and vulnerable around the world when you have to listen to women. Who wants to be known as the gender general? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steph. How do I get back into the conversation now? We'll go back. Okay. Actually, I wanted to go back with my own, if I can. Can I go with my own account? Can you see me? No, you can see my. I'm trying to. Yes, I wanted to show you a couple of pictures, but we'll do without it. Anyway, just a few remarks on top of what has been said so far, which goes well in it. As Stephanie said, this is a question of image as well, and gender mainstreaming. So remember at the beginning, I was mentioning yesterday's debate between Macron and Le Pen. But the same can be said of a 2016 debate between Trump and Hillary. The level of condescendence and mansplaining that came from the part of the male candidates, which therefore has nothing to do with their political message, is just how you frame the message. It was huge. It was huge in 2016. It was huge yesterday night. And this is a major part of the problem. So especially when you are, I also told you that we started this whole project when we started preparing for training Afghan women. And we realized that they couldn't train them in the same way we would train Afghan men. So let me share on the top of what has been said, a few challenges that are some specific to women leadership in general and some specific to women leadership in international relations. So first of all, how leadership is perceived. It is a commonplace, but it has to be stressed all over and over. An assertive man is cool, an assertive woman is big. All right, or it's aggressive. So why is it okay for men to be assertive and is not fine for women to be assertive? Dressing. I'll tell you a little story. When I was preparing for the first training for the Afghans, I asked to go to Afghanistan because I thought I can't organize a training if I've never been to the country and I never talked to our stakeholders. So first of all, the foreign ministry in the beginning refused. Oh, no, it's dangerous. You can't go. So I'm persistent. I got my way. And of course, I got my way by dragging the president of a national Institute for Public Administration with me. So I would be with a man. And of the two of us, I was the one who, as a condition for going, had to take a security training. Okay, I go for the training. And the training was most boring thing I've ever done in my life. And it had one message: dress humbly. Okay, so here we get in Kabul, and I'm very humbly dressed. And this is super inappropriate. So the Afghani, first of all, are not so happy that the woman is there, young woman is a few years back, for the matter, was negotiating with them and imposing conditions. Conditions like transparency in selecting the people we were going to train. Gender quotas. They were clearly very unhappy about that. And the fact that they would train them in Italy rather than go to Afghanistan, because we wanted to take them out of the culture, especially for the women, right? So they were not happy about that, but I was clearly not dressed in an appropriate manner. Now, Giovanni, my boss, he was wearing the same suit that he was wearing in Rome, and that was perfectly fine. But I was not, so I had to beg the army, the carabinieri who were escorting us, to take me to a shop where I bought this beautiful Afghan jacket, which I always wear, to be a little bit more appropriate. Why was that so? So first of all, my boss didn't have to go to the security training. And secondly, it was a one-fit-all training for people working in the field, right? Which did not apply, but they simply did not think of it. So for women, how you dress, how you present yourself, Rita knows very well. When I was in Brussels, I always had a pair of very, very high heel shoes. So if an ambassador called me into his office, regardless of what I was wearing, I would put my high heels. Why? Because then I could see him eye to eye. Because men are often taller than women, and if someone in a position of power wants to impose their power on them, the first trick is look at the woman down. So by having my high heels, I would more or less be at his same height. And I learned, this particular man was very misogynist, so I learned a number of tricks. You know, when you give the hand and the turn, you turn it back. And there are all sorts of things that you can do to reassert, non-verbal things that you can do to reassert your power and the fact that you are equal to them. All right. But again, there is so many more challenges for women, especially the dress code is one, working in international. And then when you go to diplomacy, there are a number of further tricks. I'll give you one example. One of the tasks of a diplomat is to invite people over for social events, right? But if you are the one organizing an event, if you are the one inviting someone over for a discussion over coffee, and you are a man, and you power the coffee or the tea, oh, that is such a cool act. You know, it shows, it is interpreted that the man is very nice because he's actually serving you coffee or tea. Try that as a woman. It automatically undermines your negotiating position. The moment you power coffee or tea, you are automatically, our culture background automatically relegates you to the role of waitress. And you know, you can have the best ideas in the world, but you lose in that moment. Your negotiation is shut off. So there are a number of things that you need to learn and really force on yourself in order not to fall in the traps. And not to talk about challenges with women diplomats. You know, when you're moving and you're a man, you have your wife organizing everything. If you're a woman diplomat and you're moving, you have to organize everything on top of your regular work, or helping kids get ready for the change. So as a woman in international relation environment, there's so many more challenges that some of them are really hidden, embedded into the culture of the job that people don't think of. my question and probably topic of one of research is how does it work with homosexual couples? It's an interesting question. Which kind of challenges in this kind of environment homosexual couples encounter? I don't have an answer at the moment, but I think some can relate to the problems that women women face. And then there was another. So it's very God, I forgot the last thing I wanted to say. And yeah, no, the last thing. You may be acquainted with an article, which is Why Women Cannot Have It All by Anne-Marie Slaughter, which was, Anne-Marie Slaughter is a former dean of a Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. She was the policy planner at the US Department of State during Hillary Clinton. She's a very, very accomplished scholar, wrote tons of stuff. And yet her most read article was an article on the Atlantic, Why Women Cannot Have It All, where she said clearly, you know, she was in a top job, she was offered to stay on, she had to go back because especially one of her sons suffered. I saw the same thing when I was in Brussels. But because she was so well respected, she could say that, right? And that led to a huge of commentary. I think it was the most commented article ever. And then her husband, Andy Morazovich, wrote an article saying that he basically gave up his professional life for her. I was like, oh, come on, Andy, give me a break. You're the most published scholar in European affairs, you know. And then I thought about it. Yes, but most of his publications, most relevant publications, were actually before Anne-Marie went into the public sphere. And because they were so good, he still has that name. But if you look at it, yeah, his productivity decreased. So here you have an example of a very bright man, you know, also relating to the question, are there men who actually helping? You know, it's given, taking a step back for their wives, but at the moment you're still a small minority. So it's just a little bit of food for thought in adding to what you said, and I would open with the Q&A. So I know that, so Silvia Francescon, you raised your hand. So I don't know if you want to come in, and I can see you, but, and then I wonder, okay, Silvia, she can hear me. All right.
Yes, I can hear you, Federica.
Okay, go ahead with your question.
Yes, I can hear you. I think I didn't want to raise the hand for a question, but I thought was extremely interesting. And I'm working quite a lot on women leadership. Well, sometimes they call it, my course is female leadership. I would rather prefer to call them feminist leadership, which goes for both sides. The comment I have is that I realize, listening to you, that my point of view is still very much from the global north, in the sense that I relate very much to what you are saying, and but as you said at the beginning, when you were talking about the Afghani women, things that we were thinking could work in terms of training leadership could work for us in the global north, but not necessarily in the global south. So I think there's so much to learn also for us, I think, what really serve the women in the global south or in the east. And the same is with the example of, you know, the water the women that were collecting water, and the fact that that was the very moment when they could be free from their husbands. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to know much better from the ground what our sisters in the world need to be free. And there is perhaps a different discourse still between the North and the South in terms of liberation from oppression. It's still there, both in Europe and the United States, and today we are talking about this, I think, but is very much different from other women in the world. So thank you for organizing this, of course, and for also opening our eyes in this direction. So that was just a thank you note for all of you.
Thank you, Silvia. There is a question where we'll be able to watch a recording, where we'll post it on the website, and then we will send you a message when it's ready. Now, does any, yep, Rita, come here.
As you can see, she needed the high heels, I need stilts.
You good? There.
Signs, things. Oh, down there. Sorry about this, but that's the Italian genes, apart from Federica, who's Italian as well, but definitely taller than me. My question for the speakers, who I'm not seeing, is because they are talking about things in which women traditionally have not been considered prominent. Diplomacy, the military, the women in these fields have not had for a long time any preeminence. And my question is, in these fields particularly, what is happening to women who actually now go and work in these fields? Because I am Italian, but I work in Belgium for the UK. I can see Liz Truss, foreign minister. She loves to be photographed in full battle fatigue on top of tanks. I think of somebody like Priti Patel, who is the Home Office Secretary, who is behaving like one of the worst possible slave traders of modern times. So I grew up with the thought, the idea that if women went into power, if they had power, would do things better. They would bring different perspective, particularly, for example, in areas where they had not had the chance for a long time to shine, like diplomacy or the military. Why shouldn't women be able to work in these fields? And they will bring a different perspective. They will bring different skills, different ways of doing things, of speaking to each other. It seems to me, though, that at least in our world, in the West, women actually are not doing, they are aping men in these roles. So I am asking, why is this? Is it a lack of culture? Is it because still women feel that they cannot shine unless they behave like men, that they cannot have that respect, they cannot be listened to if they don't behave like men? Or is it just because it's a question of persons? Men, women, it doesn't matter. It depends the person that you are. It doesn't depend on your gender. I am, after a long time, starting to think, actually, yes, it's true that women have been discriminated against, they still are. But the reason why this is happening is that we are discovering that actually men and women are people with the character and that we have to judge them on the basis of their character, particularly when we elect them to something. And I'm all in favor of quotas. So it's not that. It's just that I'm starting to think that actually there isn't a factor that if you are a woman, you are better. Well, and I'd like to know the opinion of our speakers.
I actually have an answer.
Who wants to go in? Oh, who wants to go on this?
Fed, should I answer the question or?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so I teach a class on gender and international relations, and one of the major questions we ask is, would the world be different if it was run by women instead of men? And you can see that's the place to go. And I'm very proud, and we worked a lot with the stuff that Mary Caprioli has done, if you've read her research. And I'm proud that my student, Courtney Burns, she took the ball and ran with it and made it her career. And she's now an assistant professor who writes on this. And the answer is really quite simple. If you have a woman who goes to the high echelons of power and the other seats are almost exclusively or exclusively held by men, then the women will ape the men, as you say. And so, for example, women are more likely to use violence, to use, like, let's say, limited strikes. I'm not saying necessarily going to war, but use military power to demonstrate that they are powerful and that they can protect the country. And they're more likely to do things that the men would do. However, if you have equal rights between men and women, and you have a significant proportion, not necessarily half, but a significant proportion of the parliament, legislature, Congress represented by women, then both men and women will behave differently in those positions of power, representing the different gender dynamic that's in the government. So in the end, if you're looking to reduce intrastate violence, you need to have a gender balance. If you're looking to reduce interstate violence, you need to have a gender balance. This actually, so for me, the interesting question in terms of international relations is, does this properly replace democratic peace theory? That it's not so much a question as to whether they're democracies, but as to whether women are appropriately represented, because that seems to have a larger influence on peace. So just in summary, to answer your question, yes, women are aping men in situations where men dominate, because this is what has to be done to be accepted by the men. However, when we have governments and societies where it's more equal, then you're going in terms of gender balance in general and women's rights, then the women and the men both are less likely to hew to these images of masculinity and how men in abstract behave using military violence, etc. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie. Glenda, you want to come in?
Stephanie gave such a great answer, and it resonates, I think, with some of the work that I'm doing in an ERC-funded project on international economic thinking, where we are actually asking, what difference do women make? And in this case, it's finding women economic thinkers in international organizations, because often through the 20th century, women who studied economics often didn't get jobs within ministries or in academies, but they did find international institutions a place where they would come in at sort of mid-level in these bureaucracies. And interestingly, the work that has been done on this, looking at, for example, United Nations Regional Economic Commission in Latin America, has found that if you go looking through the publications where women have, in Stephanie's terms, where they've been, more represented, they've produced, a broadened spectrum of thinking on the purpose of economic policy in this commission, and emphasize much more questions of welfare and social justice, and the needs of women. So I think probably what's being articulated in the IR studies is translates into other contexts. The only thing I'd say is I was also part of a recent workshop in Siena on women's roles in peace building, which was mainly sort of practitioners and legal scholars. And there, what was interesting is, looking at, the UN statistics on countries that have met sort of, I guess, what might be the equivalent of gender mainstreaming objectives. The numbers didn't always reflect influence. You could have, UAE fairly high up on that, but actually women have no rights. So I think that's the qualifying bit that Stephanie describes, right? It's not just the numbers, but in, appropriately representative sort of roles, having rights and influence more broadly, where the numbers reflect that. So it's not just a matter of counting, I think. But, and of course, if we go back to the, 18th and 19th centuries, what's interesting in terms of, the women that take these roles in salons is they have very different political views. I mean, the book doesn't only look at women, but of the women that are most prominent in these roles in the politics between states in the first half of the 19th century, we also get very conservative women who use that role in order to promote agendas of, religious hierarchy and exclusion, war, rather than peace. But in fact, then, the opposite is also true, that through the 19th and 20th centuries, that women who collectively organize tend to do so on behalf of, more peace-oriented social justice movements. And I haven't done the figures, but, it's not as I think was it Rita was saying, it's obviously, gender doesn't determine your politics, but it's kind of interesting in under what social and cultural conditions, women and men, I suppose, take the opportunity to use their position to reflect on a broader, experience and broader categories of need and imperative.
Very much. Going to Rita's question. This is something I've been trying to reflect for a while. And so, for instance, first of all, whether a woman does well or not, let me shut that up. Okay. Whether a woman does well or not in politics, whether this is foreign policy or politics, how do you assess that? It's a qualitative question. And in most likely, we assess it in terms of whether it aligns with our values or not. This is something like what Glenda was saying. So a woman that is empowered, that is aligned with my political and ethical values, I'll probably tend to judge her well in terms of results. And if someone does not align with my values, I probably tend to judge her output in negative terms. So it's very hard to actually assess. Probably if you're a woman and in power in economics, you're Minister of Economics or Minister of Finance, it's easier to assess whether your work was good or bad. I mean, did you lead the country in deficit? Was there economic growth? Yes or no. So it's very hard. If we look at foreign policy, at the women that have been in power, the glass is really half empty and half full. If you look at the US, was Hillary Clinton better than John Kerry? I personally don't think so, right? Because Kerry did close a number of agreements like Iran or the Paris Agreement, which Hillary did not. Was he able to close those agreements because of the work that came before? That's an open question. But what Hillary really did was to bring the woman question on the table. I think this is her biggest policy output. The famous phrase, women's rights are human rights, right? So this is, I think, a huge addition to foreign policy, which probably not everyone would see in the same way. But she also did mistakes, in my opinion, like Libya. Libya was a huge mistake. And ironically, is still seen as a good example of best example of transatlantic cooperation. So mixed, very mixed bag, but at the end of the day, it really comes to what my values are. So it's really, this is why the book on women in foreign policy hasn't come out yet, because I'm still trying to find a solution. And to be frank, as a feminist, I so want to come up with a full glass and say women leaders did the difference. But as a scholar, not so much. So I'm still trying to work on that. Oh, we have questions here. Okay, does the French saloon, anonymous attendee, does the French saloon training mechanism continue today, or is it in a different form? Would it be feasible to conduct saloons for training women in leadership? Who wants to answer that?
I don't know, Stephanie. It's a nice idea, isn't it? I love the idea. I love to run a salon. But I think the important part of that story, and I'd be interested to hear what Stephanie has to say, is the emphasis it places on talk, right, and diplomacy and negotiation. And this is something that I think that was, always an intrinsic part of, kind of the liberal international order that's been under sort of emphasized. And often the attacks on the UN, for example, it's all talk. But talk is the kernel of diplomacy, and the point that that's how negotiation and arbitration take place. And some of the emphasis in the 20th century went on to kind of legal arbitration. But I think, the importance of soft power and diplomacy has, over the last decade or more, been really undermined in foreign policy areas. Maybe it's coming back, but I'm just thinking of, current states that are, run by kind of less interventionist government policies, for example, that tend to not emphasize the importance of diplomacy, which is what I think you get with the salon. So maybe one could resurrect that. I don't know. We'd have to find some saloniers, but it's a very elitist. It's not kind of it's not anti-democratic, but it took place in the context of a world of limited political representation. So maybe you take a much broader notion of the public sphere, which is another sort of part of this story. I think it goes back to the early 19th century as well. The emphasis de Stael puts it on the importance of not of public opinion so much, which in the kind of discussions through the 20th century amongst feminists engaging foreign policy was a point of some controversy, whether, having public opinion involved would make for a more enlightened foreign policy or not, or rather on the public sphere and its importance, right, as a lively place of debate and discussion. So there's that dimension as well.
So there is sorry, were you done?
Yeah, go.
There was an opinion poll that asked Americans how comfortable they felt with their understanding or discussion of international affairs. And only 5% of Americans said they felt comfortable with such discussions. And breaking that down by gender, only 3% of women felt that they were comfortable. And I was always like, yay, I'm one of them. Right. But but I think it shows that there's a fear, if you will. It's intimidating to talk about international affairs. And this isn't something just addressed at women, although it may impact them more, but just, I would say, I can speak for Americans in general. In fact, if you look at public opinion, and by that I mean Zoller and Converse and so many others, people don't really, when they give opinions on international affairs, it's not because they've studied them or know what's going on. It's because they've heard something in the news. Right? They're being cued by political leaders, or they're being cued by the media, or something that they've read on social media along those lines. And what they'll do is they'll use heuristics. In other words, they're like, well, my value is to do this. My value is to help Christians. My value is to support democracy, right? My whatever it is, my view is to support Trump and whatever he supports. And it's these heuristics that give people answers for these questions on whatever opinion poll and whatever, like on the Ukraine war or what have you. So this is I think it sounds great. I agree with Glenda and what she said, a place where people could be safe to discuss this. I mean, that sounds fantastic. It is elitist, what you're saying, but it's nice just to have any venue for that. I like to think of that as the university, right? Where a place, I'm at a public university. I feel very strongly about teaching at a public university where I can teach. I tell my students, one of the things I want you to do is to feel comfortable in a cocktail party, as crazy as that sounds. When someone comes up to you and it's like blah, 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 and I teach them how to dissect their arguments so they can say something back and understand where they're coming from. But this is something that most people don't feel comfortable with. And we just have to understand that when it comes to international affairs, it is an elite business, I would argue. Hope that helps. Thanks.
Thank you. Drew, you want to have a question?
I don't try that one. Well, thank you. I'm Drew Dallo from Professor of Political Science, University of Stockholm. I'm only supposed to speak tomorrow, but I can't. Please allow me to make some remarks here. I think there's too much discussion about women as individuals, too much discussion about. That's fine.
Can you hear me now?
Good.
All right, my position is, now it's double voice. Yeah, close your mic. Right, sorry. No, I think it's okay now. Please allow me to make this. I think there's too much discussion about women as individuals and women's individual characters when we make this discussion about whether women in leadership makes a difference. And I do think that, of course, there are individual characteristics. I used to show my students a picture of Margaret Thatcher sitting in her government with only men ministers, and she's the one who appoints ministers, right? So she reproduces patriarchy, even if she's a woman. And then the Norwegian Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the first 50-50 in my government, men and women. Of course, the individual, right? But at the same time, we have to look at this as the question of the institutions and the structures. And you can take the example of corruption. You know that we have found a correlation between less corruption, more women in power. Is that because women are born less corrupt? No. That's because corruption is not an individual affair, not among men either. It's an atmosphere in a certain institution in which it's allowed, and they all know it, because they all do it, to take bribes. So it's a question of making, how is the institution around these things? And we have to look at this as social institutions or a feminist institutional perspective. And of course, here we come back to the point which Anderson made about how many women are there. And there we will come back to the importance of having quotas to make this different surrounding. And I'll talk about that tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have several questions, which given the short time, I will read together. Sorry, no, not this. Okay. So, where are the questions? So, thank you, Monia Tayali. Thank you for this panel and the conference as a whole. I really appreciated the anecdotes that were shared from Sri Lanka and Afghanistan, highlighting essentially that context matter and gender mainstreaming requires attention to contextual differences. My question is regarding transnational feminist networks, particularly those from those regions, such as Muslim transnational feminist networks, like women living under Muslim laws or Masa. To what extent are American and EU foreign policy entities collaborating and including expertise from such networks who are equally interested in peace, sustainable justice, and gender equality? And then we have Anonymous for Steph. Question for Stephanie. Can you speculate on what might happen, persecution of war crimes, especially against women in Ukraine? Agnes, sir, what do you think we can speak about foreign policy without economy issues? What about the economy power? Shall or should work hands in hands the women in foreign culture and economic policy? Should we put together hard and soft policy? Should we women put together the hard and soft diplomacy policy? Okay, who wants to go?
So I'm sorry, Mona, I can't answer your question definitively. I can just say that traditionally, both the United States and the EU have been very good. It's definitely been part of their policy for more than 30 years, probably closer to 50 years, to work with different civil society organizations of all sorts, all ilks, NGOs, and that would include what you have here, women living under Muslim laws, and the Muslim transnational feminist, other transnational feminist networks. That goes perfectly with what the United States does. The problem is, as you could tell from my case study with Kosovo, is certainly they were consulted, just nothing happened afterward. I think that's the more interesting question. But in terms of are they being talked to, my guess would be yes. That's just part of, you know, what embassies do on the ground, especially if they're playing a part in some sort of crisis management mission. But I can't say more specifically, and I'm sorry about that. In terms of about war crimes in Ukraine, since neither Ukraine nor Russia are members of the Rome Statute, which established the International Criminal Court, the chances are very low. There is a possibility when all of this is over of Ukraine having their own special tribunal, as we've had in other places. That's a possibility. Russia still would not, I doubt they would send any people over. We could have an Israeli kind of Mossad example where people are captured and brought in for trial, which is something that happened with, you know, well, I wouldn't say with Nuremberg, but with crimes against humanity from the Holocaust. That Israel was prosecuting, and that I always thought was fascinating. That's legal under international law to kidnap someone in a foreign country and bring them back for trial. There's an article by, I don't know if any of you follow Lawfare, the Lawfare blog, and they have an article on that, and I would just direct you to it.
Glenda.
And then I guess last thing I'll say is, Agnes, of course, all these things are intermestic, right? You know, they all play a role. I think I think academics may divide them more than practitioners, just because it's a little bit easier. Economists have their own theories, right? And you have like different theories for, let's say, diplomacy versus military. But I think that, of course, they all interact and they have to be dealt with together. Okay, thanks.
Glenda.
Well, I guess in some ways this relates to a question I would have asked Stephanie, because I'm really interested in, you know, what difference this new kind of signing up to feminist foreign policy makes, particularly when, I mean, because it's very different, it seems, from what I can tell, you know, depending on which country signs up to it and how they articulate it. And sometimes it's like, oh, it's about, you know, protecting women and girls or women and children. But in fact, you know, in the German case, there's a foreign policy minister who's a Green and a feminist, articulating articulating feminist foreign policy, and in that way, you know, putting together hard and soft, I suppose, and having to navigate the relationship between hard and soft diplomacy in terms of the objectives of diplomacy and understand, you know, articulating them in relationship to this feminist foreign policy. And so I think it's really interesting times. I mean, not radical probably, but interesting, and you know, and I wouldn't mind hearing what Stephanie thinks about that in relationship to the broader agenda of gender mainstreaming. In terms of economic power, you know, there's been some interesting new work on the history of sanctions, because sanctions are such a big part of the use of economic power now. And in Nicholas Mulder's book on the economic weapon that's come out recently, and Nick has actually had quite a bit to say on sanctions and the fact that they're not very, you know, it's not clear what kind of effect they will have. In that history, it does seem as if, you know, the people that spoke out most often and most clearly about the unwanted and possibly unintended, and in some cases actually intended consequences of economic sanctions, which is the suffering inflicted on, you know, civilian populations, and often women, and you know, who have no say otherwise. That, you know, it's clear that in the past, at least, the people making this decisions are not the same as those who suffer the consequences of economic sanctions. And we would need to think with some, if we follow the advice of the women who have been most outspoken against them through the 20th century, since the kind of use of this economic weapon, would need to be thinking very carefully about what are the consequences of extensive sanctions when they affect border populations. Is it that will lead to regime change, which is often the idea that's been articulated, that if the people suffer enough, they'll revolt? Or in fact, has it led to more radicalization of sort of expansionist policies of the state, as in the case of Japan in the 1930s and 40s? So I think it's worth hearing the voices historically on the use of economic power and its effect. And many of those voices have in fact been women and pacifist organizations.
Okay.
Should I
Go ahead.
should I address, just because she was like asked out, like called out to answer that question? It's like, okay, I'm going to, for me, the fun part of being an academic is to say things that maybe you shouldn't say. And the reason why I start out with that is I am such a believer in free speech and putting ideas out there, even if they're like maybe not the most PC, just to get us to talk and think about things in ways that we haven't. And I don't know if this gets to your feminist foreign policy, which I agree, I think is really fascinating, and I'm so glad that it's come out. But it made me think of a couple of things, and I'll just give my points. In doing my research on women and peace negotiations, the men said that they didn't want women at the table because they were afraid that they would be too conciliatory, that they would sell the state away, that they would give things away that would affect the status of the country. That, in other words, women didn't think status was as important, women thought that peace and consent.
Oops.
I know, a crucial moment.
Yeah. Okay,
You froze, Stephanie, you froze.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't see. Oh no. And I'm like, even like, okay, I'll say it again. Let me know if I freeze, because I saw everyone go to this. I was like, oh man, was that so bad that what I said? All right. Men are concerned about having women at the negotiating table because they fear that they're going to sell everything away in exchange for peace. So women seem to prize peace and conciliation and consensus more than status, and men seem to prize status more. In general, if you look at women on corporate boards, maybe you've heard this, women, when you have a balance of men and women on corporate boards, the corporations are more likely to make money. And the reason why is that the women seem to have an effect on men who are more willing to take risks. And so they take high risks where they could win high or they could lose a lot. The women don't feel comfortable with that. They're more risk averse. And so by stopping the men from doing sort of like I don't want to say like lottery tickets, but things that would either make them or break them, they put the brake on it. And so they make more profits steadily. So not the extreme profits, but steadier. So this has always got me wondering, does this have anything to do with biology? If you, and I'll tell you what made me think of this. My daughter was ice skating as a little girl, and all these high schoolers, I didn't know how much I hated high schoolers at the time, and my little kid was 6, and the men were running skating as fast as they could into the wall when my little girl was trying to skate around, and the girls were encouraging them to do it. And it was sort of like who could be fastest and who can hit the wall hardest to impress the girls. And that really got me thinking, because I thought it was such crazy behavior. And I was really worried they were going to run my little 6-year-old over. Is if you have a war and all the men die except for one, you can still replace your nation by keeping the women separate. Now, also, I'm from Wyoming. I own a cattle ranch. I've dealt a lot with that. And so I keep thinking that you have to keep your cows safe and you have just one bull and then you can have what you need. But I wonder if that makes men need more riskier behavior, because if they can win, right, they can win big. They can impregnate more females, right? It's something they can do. And the women want to take care of their babies, whatever happens, right? This is something that, this is the whole idea of genocide. We see this again and again, is that if you impregnate these women, they're not going to get rid of their children. And therefore, they're going to be raising they're going to be raising another ethnic group's child, right? And in this way, you displace the group that's there. So this is where, like I said, it gets kind of crazy. This, you know, I know it's a little controversial, the stuff I'm saying, but for me, what's really interesting about this feminist foreign policy is there something that whether it's socialized or it's biological, that changes mindset, where a feminist foreign policy is something that is so different? Is it something that takes equality more, social justice more, takes social status less? And is this something that is going to become more of a norm, especially if you think of the EU, which is all about kind of getting rid of social status and making countries equal? That's something that the UK didn't like, and part of what was behind Brexit. They wanted to keep their social status as being the best. Anyway, hopefully some fun food for thought. I just stand here as someone who's throwing out crazy ideas, and I want them to be seen as such. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That is a great way to finish, I think, the panel.